Welcome to another one of our DEC lectures. As you know, these are more or less monthly events where we bring distinguished academics to the bank so that we can all expand our horizons and catch up with cutting-edge research that's happening out there. This time around, we made a point of inviting all women speakers, a group of path-breaking, brilliant women making very important contributions to economics. So I'm very pleased to be continuing our series now with Pascaline Dupas. For those of you who do not know her, she's an associate professor at Stanford University. Obviously, she's a development economist focusing on Africa. She's also a very diverse researcher, having published on health, education, micro-savings, among many other interesting topics. Pascaline is also a very productive researcher, and I'm sure everyone has a favorite paper of her. For me, it is the Kenyan field experiment with Jonathan Robinson, where they've been trying to understand, get deep into what makes poor people not save enough. So they show that simply providing a safe place to keep money was sufficient for these people to increase their savings and reduce their vulnerability to health shocks. So for me, certainly that's a must-read paper, but I'm sure that you all have your own must-read papers of Pascaline. So today, let me just give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will walk around if it's okay. Slowly, I was told, because there are cameras. Hopefully my slides will show up in a minute. The work I'll present is on the impact of free secondary education. It's work joint with, maybe I have to do something? I don't know. I'm waving to the people behind the mirror because they are the ones who have control. Okay, the slides, how do I get them? Maybe they're sleeping. Anyway, I'll get started, and hopefully the slides will show up. So the work is joined with Michael Kremer from Harvard University and Esther Duflo from MIT. And this is something that we started now over 10 years ago. So it's my great pleasure to have a chance to share this with you. This is one of these studies that it's actually very hard to get funding for. You get started thinking, well, let's pretend it's only a 2-year study so that we can get started. And then after 2 years, you look for funding again to keep on going and keep on going. So we've been doing this now for 10 years. And we think it's really valuable to do these very long-term studies. So hopefully I'll convince you that this is something that you should all get into the business of doing. All right. So we also want to, because it's been a long-term process, we got funding from a number of sources that I've highlighted on the slides. The main one being the National Institute of Health. And we've had the help of very many staff in the field doing surveys, helping with data management. So I also want to acknowledge their contributions, although there are too many of them for me to name all of them. Okay, so the starting point of this research was that when we started 10 years ago already, the number of kids in primary school had really surged and increased. Thanks to universal primary education being passed in many countries and being pushed for by a number of international organizations like the World Bank. And now the next question is, how do you increase access to secondary education? And that's one of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to increase considerably the reach of secondary education. When you think about the likely effects of secondary education on people, it's easy to imagine potential large effects on people's lives, both economic and social. But obviously, the cost is not trivial. So the cost of secondary education is greater than the cost of primary education because you need more material, better trained teachers, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so the question is it worth the cost? And that's going to be a function of, obviously, the quality of secondary education. And some folks are quite pessimistic that the type of curricula that are in place in many poor countries may not necessarily lead to people being super productive in the labor market if, let's say, the curriculum is too academic and not enough focused on the skills that are needed in the labor market. And so, for example, from an historical perspective, Claudia Goldin has shown that in the U.S. there was an adaptation of the curriculum in secondary school towards labor market and away from more like classics and stuff. You don't need to know, Latin to do well in the labor market. And so adapting the curriculum was a key part of making sure there are returns to secondary education in the U.S., for example. So the evidence on this is very little. We know quite a bit about primary education, but we know very little about secondary education. The evidence from developed countries may not be super helpful. And so the only study really that tells us much about the returns to secondary education is Owen's study. It's sitting right here, forthcoming in the GHR, where he exploits discontinuity in Kenya, which means whereby only kids who score high enough on the primary school exit exam can get into secondary school. And so with that, he's able to look at the effect on young women and young men by the time they are 18 or 20, and he found that getting access to secondary education delays fertility for women, and for men, for which he has some information on labor market outcomes, he finds some effect on the likelihood of being formally versus informally employed. Okay, so this is a very interesting study that tells us what is the effect of going into secondary school if you are a marginal student. You can barely make it because you're just at the cutoff for admission. Okay, so this is what we're going to do is going to be looking at similar effects over a longer period of time using a different strategy. We're going to try to estimate the returns to getting into secondary school for those who are at the margin, not of making it into school, but at the margin of not being able to pay. Okay, so those very people who would be affected by a change in the policy. So people who would benefit from a decrease in the fees to go to secondary school, people who would benefit from free secondary education. So people who've been admitted already, so they are not just barely making it, they can be all around the distribution of scores as long as they are above the cutoff, but they cannot afford to go. Okay? And so we've done this in Ghana the brute force way. So now 10 years ago, we identified students who had been admitted into senior high school in Ghana but could not enroll. So 2 to 3 months after the start of the school year, they were not in school, even though they had been admitted. Okay? And that was because they couldn't afford to pay the fees. And so among those that we enlisted them until we had reached the number of 2,064, which was what our budget allowed us to enroll in our study. Okay? And once we had found 2,064 of them, obviously there were many more in the country, but we could only enroll that many in our study. We randomly selected a third of them through a lottery, and then we gave them a scholarship for secondary school. Okay? So they could enroll immediately, and then that was for a 4-year, at the time it was a 4-year system. And since then we've just been waiting for them to go through their secondary education and then get out and go out there into a labor market and see what happens to their lives, okay? So really this design enables us to examine the impact of getting an opportunity to go to secondary education for free, holding the admission criteria, and other means to finance school constant. Okay, so that's really the relevant margin you want to look at when you think about countries that are thinking of moving to secondary education. So at the time we started, Ghana was having this discussion. Since then, as of last September, they actually moved to free secondary education. And so it's exactly those students in our sample that are affected by that. Okay. So I have a lot of things to share because we did a lot in 10 years. But please do not hesitate to interrupt me and ask questions. I know that there's I don't know, it's called a live broadcast or something. So if you ask a question, I will just first repeat it so that people can hear it, and then I answer it. Please do ask questions, otherwise it's very hard to know if you're bored or finding too simplistic, or so I'm used to being asked questions, even tough questions, so don't hesitate, so that it can be a journey together rather than me alone talking up there. Okay. So I'll give you a little bit more background, tell you about the data we have, and then we'll kind of like go through a series of effects. So first, I'll just show you the impact that the scholarship had on secondary education. So you can think of this as the first stage. Did the scholarship change how much education people get? And we'll focus on secondary education. Did they learn anything? And then after that, we look at impacts on their lives, impacts on fertility, marriage, and health behavior, and then looking at the labor market outcomes, which, as you will see, we are not yet, despite the long-term follow-up, in a great position to talk about, because we still have some of the students in tertiary education. Okay, and so this is going to be kind of like the one of the punchline of this is that 10 years is not enough. Okay, and so you have to stay tuned, and I'll come back maybe in 5 years to tell you more. Okay, and then I'll conclude. All right. Okay. Yeah, there's a question. No. Okay. All right. So the education system in Ghana is composed of primary school, then junior high school, then senior high school. Okay, and at each step, some kids fall off. Okay, so it's estimated that about 95% of primary school, the primary school enrollment is about 95%, and it drops to 75% for junior high school. Then at the end of junior high school, there's a finishing exam that you have to take. Now, only 70% of those who are in junior high school take that exam. Okay? Of those who take the test, only 60% of them pass. And of those who pass, we don't actually know how many enroll. We estimate an upper bound of 80% based on some statistics provided by Kenny Ajayi in a 2014 paper, but actually it's been very difficult to get information on the share of people admitted who actually enroll. Okay. But so this is, if you multiply all these numbers together, so you say take, I guess I can't use a pointer, 75% times 70% times 60% times 80%, okay. You're down to something like 25% enrollment in senior high school. Okay, so there's a big drop-off from junior high school to senior high school. Okay. And tuition seemed to be the main factor explaining this drop-off. Obviously, there is a fact that people don't even take the test or don't pass the test if they take it, so that's also a factor. But to the extent that people anticipate that they won't be able to pay for it anyway, their incentives to work hard and study towards the tests are reduced. Okay, so it's hard to know what share of the students who don't take the exam or pass the exam are students who maybe would be inspired to try a little bit harder if it was free. So the tuition we think is responsible for a big part of this drop-off is in 2011, for example, it was 500 Ghana cedis per year, and so that compares to 2,400 Ghana cedis GDP per capita that year. Okay, so that's a non-trivial share of people's income, and another factor that may explain the drop-off is also the distance. Okay, so there are only 700 senior high school in the entire country versus 9,000 junior high school. Okay, so when you have to make the transition from junior high to senior high, you have to go much further in distance. And there is a gender gap there as well, with girls 6 percentage points or 20% less likely to reach senior high school. There is a very small technical vocational institute system in parallel that very few people go into. Okay, so reducing the cost of secondary school does not really have much of an effect in terms of crowding out people from this system, which is absolutely very tiny. Okay, so a little bit more about our experimental design. So as I said, we enrolled 2,064 students, sampled from 177 senior high school across 5 regions. So how did we get there? We got the list. So the Ghana education system comes up with with a list of all of the students who passed the finishing exam for junior high school, and then they placed them into a senior high school based on people's choices, so people can, say what is their favorite senior high school, a few of them, and then also the track that they want to get in. Okay, so that can be. I'll get into that in a minute, but you can choose a track or a major. Okay, so you want to do general arts or general science or visual arts or something like that. Okay, so there's a computerized system that places students into schools and majors based on their scores and based on their preferences. Okay. So we got that master list from the Ghana education system around September 2008. And then we sampled senior high schools from 5 regions. We excluded the Greater Accra, and we excluded the Volta region and then the northern regions because there were already scholarship programs in those, the northern and the Volta region, and the Greater Accra region is a bit richer. And then we just went to senior high schools with a list and said, oh, according to this computerized system list, this student was admitted as this student enrolled as of now. And it was, let's say, November 2008, and the school year started in September 2008. Okay. So from that, we could come up with a list of all the students who had been admitted but did not report and did not enroll. Okay. So then we went to the junior high school that these kids came from and said, oh, it turns out that Pascaline was supposed to have reported to, school Y, but we went to school Y, and school Y said she has not shown up. Do you know what's going on? And then the teachers in the junior high school would say, oh, yes, it's because, she cannot afford to pay the fees. Or they would say, oh, well, it's because she reported to another school. She decided to transfer, and she's now in this other school. Okay? So by double-checking what we got from the SHS with what we were told by the GHS teachers, we could now narrow down our list to students who indeed had not enrolled anywhere. Okay? And so the great majority of them, then when we went to their household and checked and we found them there, reported financial hardship as the main reason. Okay? So that's how we drew our sample. Okay? And once we had, this just over 2,000, we stopped. So in the end, we sampled students from 177 senior high school across 5 regions. One thing to note, we wanted to have gender balance in this sample because it was very important for us to be able to estimate the effects of secondary education for men and women separately. We had a hard time, just from this list of initially 177 senior high school, we had a hard time finding enough women, okay? Because fewer women get admitted, and conditional getting admitted, if they are not more or less likely to enroll. But because fewer of them get admitted, we had a hard time finding enough women. So we ended up having to dig into the previous cohort. Okay, so that means that we also had the list from the previous year, and so we have in our sample boys and girls who took the BECE exam, this junior high school finishing exam, in 2008, in July 2008 or June. But we also have women who took that exam in June 2007. So by the time it was December 2008, and we did the baseline survey with them, they had been out of school for 1.5 years. Okay? And so when I show you the results, at times I'll show you the results separately for girls who had been just, I just finished in high school, and those who had already been 1.5 years out. Okay. The scholarships we gave covered the full tuition and fees for a day student for 4 years. So we couldn't afford to pay for boarding fees, so we just paid for essentially the closest senior high school to you. And people who live too far from the senior high school closest to them, we decided not to include them in our sample, okay? Because we wanted to focus on alleviating financial barriers and getting as big of an effect we could get from that. And so we focused on people who live within 20 kilometers of the senior high school they had been admitted in. Okay. It cost us about $500 per student that we had, we gave a scholarship to. Okay, so I already alluded to this timing. People wrote this GHS exam in May 2008, finished junior high school in July. In August, they got admitted. They were supposed to start in September. We sampled them in December if they had not yet enrolled. And in January 2009, that's when we called them up. So we randomized on our computer who would get the scholarship, and then we just called them up, January 1st to say, hey, good news. You've been selected through a computer lottery for a scholarship. So you can go to your senior high school. This is a school you've been admitted to. As you know, they expect you. We've paid already. As soon as you get there, we will pay the bill for you directly to the school. Yes. Exactly. So the question is, did students then miss the first trimester? Absolutely. So the first trimester, the September to December, they missed that. So the schools were okay with us sponsoring students only starting in the second trimester, because it turns out it's quite common for students to report late, okay? Because people are struggling to get fees. So I'll show you that even in our control group, so people who did not get a scholarship, we do have a good number who managed to enroll on their own later on. And so schools are used to this. And so it's a little bit of a, de facto, that first year of senior high school is like a bit truncated. Not a ton happens in the first trimester because a number of students are not yet there. So it goes at a slow pace. Absolutely. So what you're saying, I guess I'm repeating, sorry, for the sake of people who are listening from afar. Indeed, we are going to be underestimating the returns to a full 4 year of education because in practice, our grantees only got 3 2/3 of an education. One thing to note, and I'll get back to that later, is that this cohort that started senior high school in 08-09 is the last cohort to be under the 4 year senior high school system in Ghana. For the following cohort, the following year, they moved it to 3 years. And the argument was like, well, we all know that the first year there is like half of the year is kind of like fooling around, and then we don't need a whole 4 years to teach everything. The teachers were not happy with that. But so in some sense, we are kind of like looking at something that's in between these two systems. Here's another question. Yes. So I don't know exactly the script from the top of my head, but we did tell them that there was a lottery, and that's how they got it. Yeah. So we did not say it was merit-based. No, so it covers the school bill. Okay, so the school bill that includes. So the actual tuition part is not that huge, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff like library fees and PTA fees, things that are like mandatory anyway. So anything that the parents would have had to pay from the school bill, we covered. So meals, I think, are not included unless it's part of the school system that is mandatory that you eat at the school and it's part of the bill. But I don't think it's common. So that's all we cover. So also, if some people decided to move closer to the school and rent a room closer to the school, we didn't cover that. Yes? Mm-hmm. So is it a problem that we are selecting people within a day's commute? So we can actually speak to the extent to which there is some selection, I think, because we may have baseline data on those who are further out, although I have to check that. So that's a good thought. We should look at the extent to which we are selecting richer folks. Whether this means that we are going to have an overestimate or an underestimate, I think it's an open question, because ex ante it's not obvious from a theoretical perspective whether secondary school is complement or substitute with, let's say, parental income or preparedness. If anything, I'm going to show you that the returns that we estimate are smallest on the labor market, for example, for those who are the best performers on the entrance exam, namely male students entering an academic track. Okay, for those we don't see a ton of action. So, speculate, I can do that easily. Whether I can convince you, we'll get there later on. Okay, so one thing to note is that so it's a 4-year thing. So by July 2012, that's when they would be eligible to grad from senior high school if they didn't repeat. We only paid for 4 years. So if they repeated and needed 5 years, we wouldn't end up paying for the 5th year. Okay, so they had. But repetition is not very common at the senior high school level in Ghana, so that's not much of an issue. But some of them, especially in the control group, started a year after. Okay, so for those, they would have graduated 1 year later. And then a very important fact to know that there is some sort of like a mandated gap year in Ghana between the time you finish senior high school and the time you can start tertiary. So you cannot apply for tertiary immediately. While you are still in senior high school, you have to wait until you get your WASI exam. This is a West African wide exam at the end of senior high school. And so you get your WASI exam in the summer, but then you have to wait until the next spring before you can apply for tertiary. So at best, they could have started tertiary in September 2013, so a year after finishing senior high school. And final point on the background, what do students learn while they're in senior high school? Well, it depends on the track or major they are in. All students have to take some English, math, science, social studies as part of a core, but then they have to state ex ante whether they'd rather, which track they would rather be in. And so there are 2 types of tracks, the more academic tracks, so general arts and general science, and then the others, and that's where 60% of students go, are more kind of like vocationally oriented. So there's home economics, visual arts, agriculture, technology, and business. Yes? Yeah, that's right. These are vocationally oriented majors within the senior high school system. That's in part why this TVI system that I alluded to that you're reminding me of is indeed very small, because most of the technical education is in the senior high school system. So sometimes they are called, some are like more heavily on the technical side. They are called SecTech, secondary technical schools. But almost all senior high schools do offer these 2 types. And ex ante, looking at these curricula, it's not obvious which one is the best bet. So for example, in the general arts, the students have to learn French, which some of us may think is very useful. I personally don't. Although, Ghana is very close to Cote d'Ivoire, there's a lot of migration from Ghana to Cote d'Ivoire, so maybe that can be useful. General science has a lot of advanced math, chemistry, physics, biology, but it's actually pretty hard to get in. Only 5% of students go into general science. And then the vocationally oriented majors, that's also a case where, ex ante was a bit hard to know what they are. In fact, I was furious when I realized that most of the women in our sample went into home economics. And I was like, what? I'm not paying a scholarship for you to learn how to cook. But then after talking with principals of senior high schools, I realized I was too quick to judge. And home economics is not about cooking or sewing. It's actually the gateway course to nurses training and teacher training, and it is. It's also, so I don't know why it's called home economics. I guess there was something called home economics in the US, I heard 40 years ago, that was very much about cooking and sewing, but that's different. And visual arts, it turns out to be something that's focused on like it includes quite a bit of like computer stuff and communication. So, you know, you have to pay sometimes a bit more for these vocational majors because they require more material. So this was, you know, we would pay the entire bill. So some majors we would have to pay a slightly higher bill than some others. And, you know, there's a bunch of switching. So it turns out that once people have been placed into a school and a track, once they arrive upon the school, sometimes they switch, okay? So we find that 20% of those who were admitted as academics switched to vocational, and 30% of those admitted in vocational track switched to academic, okay? So when we look at the return separately by track, we'll do what we call the intent to treat, which means that we're going to look at where were you placed, irrespective of where you end up. But it's important to note that there is actually some switching, so we are going to understand the impact of these differences by major. Yeah. So did we have more switching in the treatment group than in the control? The reverse, actually. Interestingly, we find much more, not very much switching at all in our treatment group, and much more so in the control group. So these numbers are for the control group, actually. It's smaller in the treatment group. I think it's in part because they, you know, we were paying for them. Maybe they felt like they couldn't really mess around with that. We're pretty cool, but maybe we don't look it, you know. Okay, so then the timing of the survey. So this is the part that I'm like very proud of, although it looks very small on the on the slide. But this is pretty remarkable stuff, just so you know. So, because why am I saying this? Because the last survey we did was just this summer, and we were able to survey 95.4% of our initial sample from 10 years ago. Okay. And it's like a phone survey, but there's always some people we can't reach by phone, and so then we track them in person. Okay. So how did we get there to have, you know, less than 5% attrition over 10 years, knowing that actually 2% of these 2 percentage points of these 5%, 5 percentage points is actually people who've passed away, unfortunately. So the share of people who are alive but that we cannot survey is very, very small. So how did we get there? So in 2008, when we sampled people for the survey and did our baseline, we gave everyone a cell phone, treatment and control included. Okay. So I don't know how many of you remember Ghana in 2008, but a cell phone for a 16-year-old was pretty exciting. Okay. We gave them the Nokia, you know, the little Nokia, super basic Nokia phones. And why did we do that? Because we also gave them a SIM card and a number, which obviously we had in our records. And then we would call that number once a year, just to verify that we could still reach them. Okay? And to incentivize them to keep the same number, because these SIM cards are very cheap and, you know, you can like change them easily, we said every 6 months we'll send you airtime. We call it a top-up. A little bit of money so that you have an incentive to keep that number. Okay, so that worked pretty well. And in the spring 2013, so remember that's when they were just in that gap year between senior high school and possibly tertiary, we did an in-person survey. Okay, and already that was 5 years out, and we were able to survey 96.3% of them. Okay, and the advantage of doing an in-person survey was that we could do a whole bunch, asking them, you know, everything under the sun, including trying to measure their cognitive skills to be able to look at the effects of the scholarship on what they had learned. Okay. Now, at that time, we had to give them a new phone. I really didn't want to because it's expensive. But the project coordinator in Ghana said, no, Pascal, you have to give them a new phone because this Nokia thing is really like, you know, come on. I was like, really? I still had a BlackBerry at the time, so I was like, what's wrong? You know, like, but he said, no, you need to give them a Facebook-enabled phone. Like, Facebook? I'm not even on Facebook. But I abided. And so we gave them a new, fancier phone. It was keeping the same SIM card if they still had it, or if they had, you know, we didn't have a good working number for them. We gave them a new number that we again kept. track of. And since then, we've not been following them in person. We are instead do phone surveys, which are much cheaper. And it's really, for me, it was really kind of like a complete revolution because for years and years I've been doing these paper surveys for all of my studies. And when you can suddenly survey people on the phone, it's like you can do so much more for much cheaper. Obviously, you cannot survey them for 2.5 hours on the phone, so you're constrained and you can only ask a small set of questions. The survey cannot be more than 25 minutes on the phone, otherwise people start getting very tired and hang up on you. But we find we can get very good quality data using phone surveys. And typically, when we do this, so we do this every year now, we manage to reach 85% of our sample on the phone. And then there's always like 10%, 12% that we can't reach them. Their phone is never on. Somehow they change numbers. We can't find them. And so then we look for them in person. So we go back to their the place where their parents were in 2008 when we sampled them initially. And then from there, we get information over their whereabouts and we track them. Sometimes it can take us like 5 days to finally find the person. But we typically manage, and then we reach a survey rate of around 96% every time. Okay? So the data I'm going to show you today will be, some of it will come from this in-person survey from 2013. So for example, when I show you the impacts on cognitive skills, this will be based on measurements we did in 2013 in person. But then when I show you outcomes on longer-term impacts like family structure and labor market outcomes, I'll be relying on these later surveys, okay? And in particular, the 2017 surveys, which gives us the most recent information, okay? One thing to note is that we had a hard time, and we are still struggling a little bit to measure labor market outcomes the best possible way. In the spring 2015, the first phone follow-up survey, that's when we started putting in labor market outcome questions in detail. And we didn't do a good job. Why? Because we asked people, what's your main activity? And then we had like 99 potential codes. Okay? And then based on what they said, we then had a skip pattern, and then we asked them how much money did they make. Now, when I got the data back, I realized that more than half of the people answered the question, what's your main activity, with code 99, nothing. I was like, what? We have 99 codes? And everybody has to pick all that. And so I was like, what does it mean, nothing? So because they said nothing, then we didn't ask them anything about their earnings. Okay? So I thought it was really odd, and how could they even find food to eat if they do nothing? So then I spent quite a bit of time with some of my students. We went to Ghana for 2 weeks, and we had a list of all the 99s. And we just looked for a whole bunch of them. And our mission was to understand, what does it mean that you do nothing? And then we realized, well, people, when they just scramble around and work here and there on a construction site or help in the local business and work, they don't think of this as a main activity. If you say, what is your main activity? And people are still waiting for that job that they are hoping for, they say I do nothing. That's not because they don't earn any money. That's just because they don't want to think of themselves as just, my main activity is just to scramble around to find, little money. No, that's not your activity, okay? So in the later rounds in 2016 and in we improved the survey, and then we asked, okay, in the last week, tell me all of the ways through which you've earned income, and the week before, okay? And then we further improved the survey in 2017, but we are, slowly making it to a point where we feel like we have a good way of and it's a situation where people, work a bit and then stop, and work a bit and then stop, and so actually capturing the labor market returns is much harder than we had anticipated. And so that's just something I wanted to put out there, which is, I would love to hear also for those of you who have experience measuring this type of stuff, if you have good suggestions for how we can do that better. Okay. There was a question, yeah. So did we find any differences in the mobile responses versus the paper responses? So we didn't have the resources to do a full-blown kind of methodological study of that. So we are not able to say, for some people we couldn't just randomize who we survey by phone and who survey in person and see whether we have systematic differences. Or we are not able to survey people both on the phone and in person to compare. So the only thing so I can't really answer that question the best possible way. But we did want to make sure it was not, complete garbage. And so we do have some questions that, are, kind of you expect to see consistency between what people said in 2013, 2015, 2016. Like, for example, have you ever had a child? Okay. If people have said yes in 2013 and then you ask them on the phone in 2015, at least it's not systematically the same answer, but if it was yes the first time around, it should be yes the second time around, and so we can check that, and on that metric we see pretty good levels of accuracy. And because we've been doing this now repeatedly, overall we are pretty confident that people don't say don't say just what comes to their mind. So we systematically have some questions that are kind of repeat from the past, and we can double check, and on that one it's good. Okay, so when we started this, we asked people, what do you think are the returns to senior high school? They were very, very optimistic. They believed that their earnings would be 276% higher if they could go to senior high school compared to not. Okay, so very, very high beliefs about the returns to senior high school. And at the time, it seemed that government employment was really seen as a pathway to these high returns. So essentially, over 70% believe that if you get a senior high school education, you can get a government job, okay, or be employed in as a teacher or a nurse, which is predominantly civil service jobs. And they thought that by age 25, you will be able to reap these benefits already. Okay, so I'm going to show you we don't find anything close to that. Okay, but ex-ante people had very high priors. Okay, so I'm not doing super well on time, so let me start giving you some results. And the format for showing the results is going to be the same across outcomes, and so hopefully once I've gone through one, it will be faster to go through the others. So first we look at the first stage, so how did the scholarships influence the total number of years of secondary education that people get and whether they completed senior high school, and then did they learn anything. Okay. So for this is showing you the effect on enrollment, and for this graph, which plots on the y-axis the share enrolled in senior high school, and the x-axis the different terms. So this is the first year, so in term 1 of 0809, no one was enrolled by construction. That's how we sampled people. And term 2, that's when we told them, okay, here you have your scholarship. And I plot separately the treatment group are the black lines, and the control group are the gray lines. And then within each group, I show you 3 lines. For the boys who took the junior high school finishing exam in 08, the girls who took the finishing exam in 08, and then these girls I mentioned who were already out of school for a year by the time we told them about the scholarship. And so the first thing to note is that there's a big jump here. So the treatment group, after we called them to say you got a scholarship, they took up the scholarship to a great extent. So it was 80% of the boys, 70% of the girls of 08, and just around 60% of the girls of 07. Okay. Now in the control group, a number of people managed to find the fees on their own. Okay. So when that second term came around, a bunch of them had convinced their uncle in the city or the grandmas in the village to put together a whole bunch of cash for them to pay the fees. Okay, so we have about 20% of the 08 cohorts who would make it, but even in the 07 cohort, so girls who had been waiting for a year and a half, just under 10% of them still managed. Okay, so which also speaks to the fact that people keep trying to go, they don't give up. And so the thing I forgot to mention that when we started all of this, at baseline, the average age in our sample was 17 years. Okay, I'm talking secondary school, but the average age at which people start is 17. Okay, and some of them don't have the money and they keep trying, and they really enroll even a year later. So by now they are 18 when they start senior high school. Okay, you can see in the control group in the following year, a huge new mass of people managed to get the funds to make it. Okay, so ultimately, by the last year, about 40% of the control group in the 08 cohort had enrolled. Okay, for the girls who were a year older, it was about half of that. The treatment group, conditional on starting, there is not much drop-off at all. Okay, and so in the end, we have a big gap in completion rate for each of our subgroups. Okay. So if I put this all together now, putting the women together and the men here, okay, this is the likelihood that people completed senior high school. The way to read this graph is on this first x-axis, which has no don't scale, because for different outcomes it's going to be a different scale. It just shows you the control group mean. So the way to read this is to say the likelihood that a male in the control group completed senior high school is 54%. So that's pretty high, okay? Okay, so that doesn't really square with this, but that's because some of them could continue later, I guess. I'm a bit confused between the graphs, but okay, I think this is the correct number for sure. So 54% of the males in the control group managed to go on their own, okay, and complete senior high school. This is 26 percentage points higher in the treatment group, okay? So the treatment effect is a 26 percentage point increase in the likelihood of completing senior high school for guys off of a base of 54, okay? So a 50% increase, okay? And then in terms of years of education, the average is 2 years in the control group, and this increases by 1.28 years in the treatment group. For women, absent the scholarship, they are slightly less likely to enroll on their own, and the treatment effect is the same in percentage point terms, slightly greater in percent terms. Okay? So overall, you can think of this as evidence that there is a big first stage. So a big difference of 26 percentage points in the likelihood of completing, okay, and about 1.25 extra year of education. Now, the first thing that this makes clear, though, is that from an econometric standpoint, we have a very big first stage, so we can go ahead and tell you what are the effects of secondary education on a bunch of stuff. But from a fiscal point of view, if you are the Minister of Education in Ghana, you're like, okay, wait a minute. These big masses here, these are what we call the inframarginals, okay? These are the people who can afford to go on their own without a scholarship, and there is a bunch of them. And this is not even all of them, because this is only among those that we selected as having to struggle to find the money, because they had not found the money by the end of the first term, right? And nevertheless, about half of them managed on their own. So if you add to that all of the folks who had enrolled in the first place, even before we went out to sample, there's a lot of inframarginals, okay? Which means that if you move from a policy of fees to a free primary education policy, I keep saying primary, secondary education policy, the cost will be much more than just the cost of the scholarships as we give them, okay? Because when you give scholarships, first of all, it's conditional on enrollment, and we could tailor them to those who couldn't, which were struggling to start with, but a blanket free secondary education policy would end up having to pay for all these inframarginals. Okay, so if we break it down by cohorts for the girls, you can see that the BEC 2017 girls, they have a very big treatment effect, actually. So they are the ones for whom there is the biggest treatment effect. Okay, so this is, to me, like very interesting and also at the same time encouraging and discouraging. It's very encouraging that even if they've been out of school for a year and a half, you call them up to say you got a scholarship, very many of them take it up, okay? It's discouraging because it means that maybe there's a dearth of opportunities for them out there, okay? Because over that year and a half, it's not like they had started doing something that was, valuable enough for them to want to keep doing it, okay? Then another question is whether we ended up getting primarily those who are doing very well in school to start with, taking up the scholarship. That's not the case. We find that when we break it down by quartile of your initial position in the junior high school finishing exam, we find even those at the very bottom have a big effect on ever enrolling in SHS or completing SHS in their years of education. Okay, so and that's consistent with with the numbers in one study that show that if you're just above the cutoff, you are still very likely to enroll if you can. Yeah. Yeah, it's within our sample. Yeah, that's right. No, so actually we have pretty much, that's a very good question. So when we break it down by quartile, as you say, we break it down by quartile in the distribution that we have, but our distribution is pretty much exactly on top of, surprisingly so, because if you are really good, it's easier to convince grandma. So if anything, we have a bit more people at the bottom quartile than in the, but it's not so far apart, actually. Okay, so what does it mean for the debate on free secondary education? So in Ghana, there's been this debate around this question in the past 3 elections. So December 28, 2008, December 2012, and December 2016, with proponents of free secondary education focusing on the benefits, the opponents focusing on costs, and these costs are these many inframarginals that I was mentioning. So in December 2016, the camp that was pro-free senior high school won the election. And free senior high school was launched in September 2017. And I was there at the time, and there were big posters around the country talking about it. Now, it was only for those who were that cohort starting that year. Okay, so those who had started the year before, too bad for them. It wasn't free for them. But for the new cohort, it was free. And the government of Ghana estimates that the policy led to 90,000 additional children to enroll in the fall. Okay. But the debate goes on because the opposition is asking, well, where is the money going to come from? Okay, and so the extent to which it's going to be possible for this policy to be maintained is still under question. So, what we think we contribute here is not an answer of yes, that's the right thing to do, or no, that's not the right thing to do. What we just contribute to is just some evidence on both the costs and the benefits. Okay, acknowledging that there are many different domains where you can see benefits. There may be private benefits on the labor market. If they are very high, that would suggest, well, maybe people can borrow or something or maybe you want to fix the credit market so that people can borrow and then repay with this extra benefits. And there may be some social benefits that would, further encourage a subsidy. Okay, so ultimately, depending on your objective function as a policymaker, you may put more weight on some benefits than some other. You may think of the cost differently depending on how you're going to raise the resources for it. And so the ultimate answer of what's the right thing to do depends on many parameters that are a choice, but the actual quantification is something that we can do for each of these costs and benefits. So on the fiscal cost in particular, we can kind of back out how costly these inframarginals are. Okay, so to get an extra year of senior high school, thanks to this policy of free secondary education, how many years of senior high school do you end up paying for? So that's kind of the way you want to think about it. So we find that the scholarship winners got 3.09 years in SHS on average, and non-scholarship winners got 1.83. Okay, and so you can get first an upper bound of the cost, assuming that changing the cost of secondary school to be 0 would have no effect on the pass rate. Remember, I said at the very beginning, if I know I can go to senior high school for free, maybe I work harder to pass, okay? If we assume there is no such effect, okay, and we assume that 80% of qualified students go to SHS regardless, and only 20% behave like our sample, then we estimate that it's pretty expensive. Free SHS requires paying for 15 years of schooling for each additional year of attainment, okay? So again, it's because there are all of these inframarginals. You end up paying for them when they would have paid on their own. And that means that to increase total attainment by 1 year, you end up paying for 15 years. Now, if we relax these very conservative estimates and say, well, maybe the promise of free secondary education is going to lead 25% of students not passing the exam right now to actually pass the exam, then the cost goes down quite a lot, and now free SHS requires paying for 6 years of schooling for each additional year of SHS attainment. Okay, and we think that this is likely a big margin that people are going to adjust to. So this is kind of like our own prior that this may be closer to the right number than this 15 years. But maybe even this is an underestimate, and you would get even more students. And so I think time will tell, because we can use data of the impact of the current policy to look at the extent to which indeed there is a big influx of students coming in. Okay. So now, did they learn anything in school? We administered a PISA type of test, although we couldn't do it in paper, because if we ask people who've been out of school for 5 years to take a test, they don't find it appealing. So we tried, it didn't work in piloting. So instead, we had this kind of like, we call it cognitive games. He was like, okay, so imagine that you are a business woman and you want to go to the market to take your eggs to the market, and you can only put 12 eggs in each in your basket, and you have 64 eggs. How many trips do you need to take, or how many baskets do you need, something like that. Okay, so that was to see not only whether they can divide 64 by 12, but also whether they can translate this real world question into the corresponding mathematical problem. And so we also ask them to read a chart and to read and stuff like that. So we have a reading test and a math test, and we standardize, and we find on average an effect of about 0.15 standard deviation. Okay, but note that women do much worse to start with. Okay, so women start doing much worse than men in the control group, and so even if we see a big treatment effect for women, getting the scholarship essentially brought them, kind of like on par with men. Okay, in the control group. Okay, so that was, especially in math, there's a big gap here. So part of it is because we had these women who were a year earlier, so there was more decay. There had been an extra year to forget. It's a bit disheartening as a teacher when you see how quickly students forget stuff that they learn in school. But that doesn't explain all of it. There's a big gender gap, which may come from the fact that women are less likely to be sent to senior high school, so maybe they try less hard while they're in junior high school. Okay. So we do find that the girls from the cohort prior do much worse than the girls from 08, but still there's a big gap even between the boys and the girls. Okay. And then if we look at how much people learn, we do find that everybody learns quite a bit, except this male in the academic tracks who start doing much better than the others. They are the ones for whom we actually see the least improvements on their scores. Okay, so this is a reading score, math score, total score. And those who start at the bottom of the distribution, they do learn a little bit, but not very much. The second quartile learn quite a bit. So everybody learns somewhat, but not too much in the bottom quartile. Though something that we were surprised about and happy with is the fact that the schools in Ghana used to be categorized as A, B, C, or D. We don't have very many A or B schools because these tend to be provincial schools that are far away. Most of our schools are C or D. And we started this study, many people told us, no, but these schools, they are really rural. Students are not going to learn anything in them. We find that even in the D schools, there is an effect on test scores, okay, and in the C schools. So it's not like these schools are so rural and remote that people cannot learn anything at them. Okay. So people do seem to learn stuff on these basic reading and test skills. We also ask them something about their knowledge of national politics, international politics, and then other stuff that may be useful in life, like knowing how to use the internet. And we do find effects there. So they are more likely to be aware of the local politics. Only men seem to see improvements in international politics. And using the internet, this is where we see a big effect for women. Okay, so in the control group, women are at a disadvantage again compared to men in terms of learning how to use the internet. Only 40% of them know in the control group versus 77% of the guys. And the treatment, which is getting exposed to the scholarship, reduces the gap a little bit. Not all the way, but there is a 9 percentage point increase in the likelihood that they know the internet by 2015, and then it shrinks over time as more and more of them learn how to use the internet. Okay, and this is not, they're also more likely to have a WhatsApp account, to have a Facebook account. Okay, so in general, the treatment effect for the girls was also to get them more connected and more on top of modern technology. Okay, although there is still a gap in connectivity there by gender. Okay, yeah.
Can you just say briefly how long the test lasted? Was it an hour test, and roughly how many items? What's the nature of this testing? And
Yeah.
did you correlate that to their scores on that?
Yeah, so the correlation with the scores on the entrance exam, you can see it from here. Okay, so those were in the bottom quartile. They scored 0.14 standard deviation lower on our test, and then so you see that there's a clear correlation with the entrance score. Okay, for the control group. Okay, which makes sense. Okay, and there were I think maybe like 12 questions in math and about 12 questions on reading and stuff like that. And it was in total, it was not very long. It was at most like 20 minutes or something like that. Yeah. And we also had kind of like a more IQ module, which was like a Raven's matrices and memories, digits backward and forward, and those things that are not supposed to be affected by education, we don't see effects on those ones. Okay. But
Total less than an hour.
oh, absolutely. Yeah. Less than an hour. Yeah. Okay, so I'm gonna speed up because I'm already way behind on time. So one thing that's interesting that we can do is we can use our scholarship as an instrument for secondary school. Okay, and compare the OLS with the IV. Okay, now there are some caveats to that, because you could say that getting a scholarship affects performance through some other means than just getting you into secondary school. Maybe you think that you've been anointed by some supreme being. That's why you get a scholarship, and everything in life is going to be easier or something like that. So maybe it makes you, I don't have to work hard because I'm just a lucky person. Maybe it boosts your self-confidence, because even though we were clear it was not merit-based, maybe people thought it was. In any case, we don't want to push on that too much, but in case you believe that the exclusion restriction holds enough, then we can compare the OLS with the IV. And when we do that, we find the OLS massively overestimates the returns to education. So what is the OLS here? We just, within the control group, we regress your score on our test on your years of education, and that's what we get, 0.2. But when we do our IV, we get 0.1, okay? So years, that's the instrument for years of secondary education with a scholarship, okay? And now the next methodological bit here that we can do is that, well, we know so much about these people. We have so many baseline variables that we can control for. Can we actually do a good job with that and recover the true, kind of like something closer to the IV with the OLS if we just throw all the observables we can at it? And in particular, to make sense of all these observables, we could use machine learning techniques to see whether we can recover the IV. And so for that, we use this double machine learning method proposed by Shanozukov alongside Esther Duflo and some other co-authors in a very recent paper published in the Economic Journal. And so here the idea is to say, take years of education, regress it on all the observables, and take the residual. Take test scores, regress it on all the observables, minus years of education, and take the residual. And then you regress that residual on the residual for years of education. Okay? That's kind of like the idea of this double de-biased machine learning. And when we do that, we actually don't really get too close to the IV, okay? So you fix the OLS with this double ML, or you reweigh the double ML method to give more weights to the compliers that you can predict using our data, and you still are quite far from the IV. So this is just saying, well, maybe we didn't waste too much of our time spending 10 years doing this. If you cannot actually figure it out through just throwing a whole bunch of observables at the computer. Okay. No, so all of this, this is with we have 2,064 people in the sample, and 1,400 or so didn't get a scholarship. So this we estimate just with 1,400 who didn't get the scholarship, the control group. And here we use the whole sample and we instrument for years of education with the scholarship. Okay. And so when we do this, again, it's using only the control group, which is 1,400. Okay. All right. So how did this change people's lives? So we're going to look at impacts on fertility, marriage, and health behavior. So here, very consistent with Owen's work, we find the likelihood of having been ever pregnant falls in the treatment group for women. Although, interestingly, it doesn't really fall early. So it's not while they are in senior high school that we see much of a gap open. It's after, okay? So we see a significant gap in pregnancy rate starting in 2013. And it carries through all the way to now. There's still a 6 to 7 percentage point gap in the likelihood of having ever started childbearing, okay? For guys, it's much harder to know because, you know, so if they report ever having a pregnant partner, then that's what we can plot, and we see a little bit happening at some point, but overall it's no significant effect, okay? But again, they may not know of all of the pregnancies that they have caused. And, you know, interestingly, we find that the effects are very big for both types of girls. Even though the 2007 cohorts have a higher likelihood of having gotten pregnant, we still see a very big treatment effect for them, even by 2017, still being 10 percentage points less likely, which is huge because 80% of them have started. So 10% is like compared to a mean of 20% who've never have started, we increase by 50% the likelihood that they have not ever started, okay? Now, they are also, this is, sorry, missing the dependent variable. This is, you know, currently living with a partner as of 2015, 2016, and 2017. So it was significantly lower for a while, and now it's losing significance. Okay, so they actually moved into a partner later. And then, so this is summarizing the results. I guess I'm missing a slide, which is the likelihood that the partner has tertiary education is significantly higher for the girls as well. So not only they are less likely to get settled with somebody, but their partner, if they have one, is more likely to have tertiary education. So they get better, if I may say, partners from the point of view of human capital. Yeah. Yeah, so is there a way to monetize these benefits so that we can include them in the cost-benefit analysis? So I think that's really tricky. That the question that always comes to mind when you think about cost-effectiveness is that you know, we can monetize this benefit, that benefit, one way or the other, and then how do you combine them? You know, do you combine them all together, knowing that they may be like interrelated? So far we have not done anything on that. I think you know, what we know for sure is that the pregnancies averted were unwanted because we also asked, was your first pregnancy you know, planned, or at the time you didn't want to have a child, and 95% of the first pregnancies were not planned or not wanted at that time. So that's really, so I think we are comfortable saying that this is a good thing for these young women. But how to monetize that, I think it's gonna be difficult, because even if we see differences later on in their income, obviously we won't be able to tease out what comes from the, you know, higher education or pregnancy. So that's something that, you know, that's why my personal view on cost effectiveness is that it's very hard to do it in a way that gives justice to the various projects when they have a multi-domain impact. Yeah. Okay, so, you know, sometimes people refer to these effects on pregnancy as an incarceration effect, because while you're in school, you're incarcerated, you don't have time to mess around and get pregnant. Well, that's not what we see here, given the pattern. It's really after that, you know, this gap emerges. And so this could be because it increases the opportunity cost of bearing and raising children, okay? And we think this is part of the story. It could also change your preferences for children. Maybe you want fewer children. We don't see evidence for that. So we asked, how many children would you have, do you hope to have in total by the time you're 50, and we see no differences there. Maybe education makes you better able to make the choices that match your preferences. So you don't want to get pregnant, knowing how to avoid pregnancies. That may be something that's easier if you're more educated. And so we find evidence for, you know, this mechanism. So as I said, there is no effect on desired fertility, but the likelihood that people do risky stuff, risky sex stuff, goes down. Okay. So this index of risky sexual behavior, we see a significant decrease for guys. The way we ask this question is whether they had ever had an STI themselves, sexually transmitted infection, whether they had a partner who had an STI, what they did when they learned that their partner had an STI, did they start using protection or stuff like that. So this is an index over 4 or 5 variables. And sorry, this is this one, index of STI risk exposure. And this one is index of risky sexual behavior. Okay. So for both of these things, we do find effects for guys. And then for women, we don't see much, but we did see a decrease in pregnancy. So and on the whole, there seems to be a reduction in risky sex. And we also ask them whether they take preventative health behaviors, like, for those of you who know my work, obviously I asked about bednet use, and then also some other health behaviors, and we do see a positive effect there. Okay. So on the whole, it seems that getting the extra education changes people's ability to take on protective health behaviors. Okay. So again, you can say, well, how does machine learning do here? And we do find that the OLS is quite biased again. But here, this is a case where the double ML helps you. Okay. And by using this double machine learning, you can actually get closer to the IV. Okay. So the takeaway is that sometimes that you can do quite well correcting the bias in OLS using a lot of observables. Sometimes you cannot, but it's not clear that you know when you can. So whether that's helpful, I guess not so much. Okay. Okay. So in our promise, I'll just take only 3 minutes, as light is like getting pale, to finish on the labor market impacts. And here, I mean, I'll just tell you, this is where we don't see a ton going on. Okay. And it's possibly surprising, but I think the main reason is that the labor market in Ghana is not good, and it takes a lot of time for people to settle, and 10 years out, it's still too early, and they've not yet settled. Okay, so I'll try to tell you the narrative that we have in mind that kind of like rationalize these results, and then you'll tell me whether you think it's a relevant one given your own expertise with labor markets in Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so the context matters here. So there was a rapid growth in Ghana for a while, but then it kind of like came to a halt right around the time, our cohort graduated. Okay, I call them my kids. Okay, so when my kids graduated, that's when everything kind of like cooled down, and there was a fiscal retrenchment, and for example, nursing and teacher trainings, which were the 2 main things that people were thinking they could do if they get into senior high school, because these were subsidized by the government, so you didn't have to pay fees to go to teacher or nurses training. And in fact, you were paid an allowance. This was kind of like shut down exactly at that time. There were no more allowances paid. Okay, so which means that suddenly this tertiary program that used to be free became non-free. So for our cohort who already had a hard time paying for senior high school, that was whammy number 1. But then, double whammy came with the fact that because the cohort right after them was only a 3-year SHS cohort, 2 cohorts graduated at the same time. Okay, so they entered the labor market at the same time as the next cohort. And so, often we're concerned about the fact that our mini experiment with only 682 scholarship recipients would, lead us to overestimate the returns to education, because we make them enter the labor market when they have a competitive edge, because not very many others got that. But this is the case where it's almost like we get closer to the general equilibrium effect, because there was a huge influx of people on the labor market with extra education that year. So it's almost as if there had been like, free SHS for a lot of people. Okay, and so the labor market is bleak. So we find by 2016, only 46% of the women and 69% of the men in our control group had positive earnings in the last months. Okay, and by 2017, it has barely changed. Okay. When we include back wages, so we realize, and that was our improvement in 2017 survey, that some people have a government job, but they are not getting paid because there's like delays in being paid. So if we add these back wages that are owed, and we also try to back out some shadow wages from when people work on their household business, how much money would they have to pay somebody to replace them if they were not working there. We get more people making money, but it's still not, very, very. It's not 100%. Okay, so what are people up to? In 2017, we do find some effect on tertiary education. So for women in particular, just below 7% of those in the control group are in tertiary education, and this increases by 4.6 percentage points in the treatment group. That's really a very big effect on tertiary education. So when I come back in 5 years, okay, and I show you the returns, I can already predict we're going to see very big effects for women just because there is a top tail who is going to tertiary school, they're in university or in teacher training, and they're going to be making much more money, okay? So they will have a fat right tail. Now, we don't only care about the tail, obviously, and the average treatment effect here is misleading because you may have a top tail that does great, but you care about the others, okay? So what I can tell you now is about what's going on with the others who are not in school. And we do see an effect on the likelihood that they are a wage worker, and that the likelihood that the job that they have requires senior high school, okay? They are also more likely to be a wage employee, but all of these effects are kind of like small, okay? So we do see significant treatment effects on these things, but they are like kind of like small potatoes, okay? So for the great majority of them, they went to senior high school, but they are still waiting for the job, okay? And when we look at earnings, and we can look at whether you have any positive earnings. We can do the inverse hyperbolic sin transformation of earnings. This is a new fad to do this, to have to deal with zero earnings, or you can do log earnings, but it's not great because you have the zeros, or total wages. We don't see much going on. The only group for which we see really an effect on earnings is the guys who went to the vocational tracks, okay? In 2016, they are doing better, and by 2017, they are doing even better. And this is actually pretty high effects for them, okay? But for everybody else, we don't see much. So essentially, if you are a guy who went to a vocational track, okay, now you're doing quite well on the labor market. Everybody else is not great, okay? If we add back wages for these women who are more likely to be wage employees, then we start seeing an effect for them up there. But it's kind of like, pulling hair, okay? So our main view is that it's not great so far. Now, do we expect things to get better for the treatment group over time? Having spent quite a bit of time talking with people, I think so. Why? Because they have not yet given up. One of the reasons why we don't see differences so much in incomes is because those who are in the treatment group, they are less likely to have settled, to have kids. They are more likely to still live with their parents. Essentially, they are free riding off of their parents, okay, as they wait for the big job. So they are all much more likely to be looking for a job, even if they are currently doing some little thing on the side. They are still much more likely to be actively searching for a job. They are more likely to be searching for a job using the internet and stuff like that, okay? And they are still hoping to make it to tertiary school. This is really an environment where people up to the age of 35, 40, they still go back to school if they can, okay? So if we look at their plans to apply to tertiary, every single year we've been asking them, we see this big, many of them are still planning to apply to tertiary, okay? And a differential effect in the treatment group, okay? And in fact, they did apply. In 2017, we still had, 40% of people, 35% of people apply for tertiary. So the good news is, the story is not over. The bad news is, we need another 10 years of funding to be able to keep going, okay? But this is, this is really an environment that is, very, very difficult for people to find the job. Having secondary education does not seem to be enough. Getting for most of them, getting tertiary maybe really the important thing, but that's tricky if you do not have the means. And so with the little money that they make here and there, maybe they can finally make it. Okay, but right now they're just waiting for the big job, essentially free riding off of their parents. They don't want to settle, starting making samosas on the side of the street. The control group, they are more likely to have settled, and they make samosas on the side of the street. So they make a little bit of money. The control group, they make less because they spend more time like studying, applying for school. It doesn't mean that 5 years down the road, they won't be doing much better. Okay, but for now, we don't see that. So from the point of view of, what are the likelihood that parents are willing to put in money for their next kid to go to senior high school, maybe it's a bit worrisome, because if I see my kid just graduated like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, they are still struggling to get that job. Maybe that's going to, make me change my beliefs about the return to senior high school in a way that's going to undermine investments by the parents, which, may be, too bad if the returns accrue, but later, okay? So I'm out of time. I'm going to, tell you, like, this machine learning stuff doesn't really solve the bias. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
Talk. So we have a little bit time for a couple more questions. You've asked questions all along, so that's not a disaster. Okay, any questions, comments? Please do go to the microphone because we're trying to webcast.
Hi, I had a question about one of the last results you showed, which was the 4.5 percentage point increase in the likelihood of being enrolled in tertiary education. I wondered whether that was concentrated in the top quartile by the tests that they had taken years earlier. So whether if you restrict to that quartile, you find 4 times larger of a treatment effect, or whether that's actually spread all around the distribution and that it's hard to predict who's going to make it through to tertiary.
Okay, so that's a good question. So from the top of my head, I cannot answer it perfectly. I can tell you that this is concentrated among the women who went to the academic track. Very few of those in the vocational track made it to tertiary, and they're going to university. But among the women, I have to check whether it's more those who are doing quite well to start with. I don't think it's going to be so concentrated. I think it's quite, I'm sure there is some relationship, but I don't think it's super strong. And in fact, you may recall that the guys had a much higher performance rate to start with, and for them we don't see effects there. I think we've come to the understanding that there may be some quotas for being admitted into university, and so conditional on having finished senior high school, it's easier for a woman to make it than for a guy because there are so many fewer women. Given the quota system. So that's my understanding of why we see these big effects for women there. Yeah.
Let me jump in with a quick question. So what is your advice to the policymakers in Ghana?
So I think the takeaways from our work so far that it's very clear that fees are a barrier for a number of students. Even those who manage to make it and pay on their own, they kind of like struggle to make the payments. They end up starting, a year later or 2 years later. Maybe this obviously comes at some cost to their household. And so if the goal is to, reach the Sustainable Development Goal in terms of attainment, it seems like reducing the fee barrier is going to be necessary. In terms of whether this is a policy that's going to pay for itself, because you can, tax people's future income to pay for the policy early on, because it's hard for children to access credit. I think that's going to depend on how much value you put on this. Social effects that we see. And so, there is now a lot of evidence that delayed childbearing is good for the young women, it's good for their children. And so how do you value that? That's the question I will ask. Is a bit tricky. We are trying to get more traction on that we have a spin-off study. This is now my grandchildren. So the children of the scholarship recipients, as they are born and they grow, we catch them and we measure outcomes for them. At 6 months, and then a year and a half, and then 5 years, we are teaming up with a child psychologist at Harvard called Elizabeth Spelker, who has designed an outstanding test to measure cognitive development. So we'll be able to say also the extent to which this influences, educating this generation influences the outcomes for the next generation. And I think so that's why I'm not going to be able to take a stand and say this is what you should do or you should not do, because there are many potential outcomes that we have not yet had a chance to measure. It's going to take time. There are many signs that there is going to be huge effects, because we know from the existing literature that there is a very positive correlation between mother's education and kids' outcome and age of the mom at birth and their outcome. But it's pretty clear to me that any exercise that puts a dollar value to each of these benefits, to put it against the fiscal cost, is going to be kind of like a house of cards game, and there'll be a lot of hypotheses that go into there, and so ultimately it's always going to be a function of what's the priority of a given policymaker and how much they value one thing or the other. I mean, I think what comes very clearly out of our work now that if you are budget constrained and you cannot make it free for everybody, scholarship for girls, are a quick win, with a caveat that the boys who went into the academic track see very high, labor market returns. So it's
Very good.
Yeah.
Sorry, I made you wait.
Oh, no problem. So, reading the labor market results, it's there are at least two competing stories. One is high school is not adding to individuals' human capital. The other story is there's no demand out there. So these guys actually have skills, but there's no demand. What's your take on this?
So my conjecture is that the no demand story is the most relevant one. Because there's like the manufacturing sector in Ghana, for example, is not developing much at all. I mean, there's a big push now by the government. And they have this like one district, one factory or something like that program, trying to attract a lot of FDI. So we'll see if that catches on. And it's kind of a catch-22 because to attract FDI, you need to have an educated workforce, and for the educated workforce to get jobs, you need to have so it's kind of like which comes first, I think, is tricky. And I think we'll see whether this free SHS policy encourages people to come in and start. But there's many other, I think, bottlenecks. So infrastructure quality is a big problem. The energy sector is a mess. And so for someone to come in and start a factory when they know that transport costs are very high and energy costs are very high, that may deter them even if they think that they can find highly educated workers out there. The fact that we see higher effects for the vocational guys rather than the academic guys suggests that maybe the academic curriculum is not that well suited for the labor market. Except that I think it's too early to tell because it could just be that those academic guys are aiming for different types of jobs and are waiting for that opportunity to come, hoping to get some tertiary education. So I think unfortunately it's a really long-term process to be able to answer the question well, and we are not yet there.
Thank you. Any other comments, questions for Pascaline? Okay. All right. Well, then please join me again thanking her for this wonderful. And thanks for coming.